think it's time to move on to our first session today. We're kicking off with a paper by Lorna Hardwick, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. So Maria Pavlou will be reading Lorna's paper on her behalf. We certainly hope this paper will generate some discussion, which we'll be happy to convey to Lorna at a later stage. Lorna's paper is entitled, "Can Transmission and Transformation be Reconciled?" And as I said, Maria will be reading it to us. Thanks.
So, can transmission and transformation be reconciled? I would like to start by thanking the organizers for their initiative in setting up the theme of this conference and for all the hard work in organization. I would also like to pay tribute to the work of the Eumenides Project, which is taking on such an important role in researching and publishing data on ancient texts and their use of mythological figures. It is this kind of collaborative and publicly oriented research that enables scholars and their students to engage on an international scale. The generous and freely available dissemination via its website of the work done by the project also enables interested members of the wider public to access information and ideas that promote understanding of ancient and modern Greek culture in the deepest and broader sense. I'm very sorry that owing to difficulties in travel at this time of the year, I am unable to be present to give my paper in person. I'm especially grateful to the organizers for arranging for it to be read on my behalf, and I send my greetings to all the participants. The focus of my paper is a key question for us all. Can transmission and transformation be reconciled? In this paper, I comment on some aspects of the aesthetic and cultural interface between transmission and transformation, and especially the implications for the engagement between ancient and modern Greek uses of mythology and narrative in the Homeric epics and the wider aesthetic influence of modern Greek poetry. There are a number of explanatory models that have been used to characterize the relationship between ancient texts and their subsequent translations, adaptations, and creative writings. The traditional emphasis on linear and chronological influences has been largely superseded by two-way models, such as dialogue and conversation, that attribute ongoing agency both to the anti-text and to the new text, and thus locate power in both the ancient and the modern, rather than in either the ancient or the modern. However, unidirectional models still persist, and these often tend to emphasize the agency of later activists in, for example, appropriation or rewriting. I suggest that no single theoretical framework is satisfactory on its own. One can, of course, find empirical examples of many kinds of activity. It is also necessary to find ways of mapping creative deviations, repressions, and unsignaled or free migrations that are not directly linear. So as my contribution to the conference, I shall examine an instance of how a 20th century example of poetry created in modern Greek has been a factor in the generation of multidirectional energy. The text that I take as central to this dynamic is Habakkuk's poem, Ithaca. This poem is so well known to all of you that in a short paper I shall not discuss it in any detail. I suggest that its importance for my topic is due, at least in part, to its spatial as well as temporal interactions with other receptions of ancient material, which focus on key tropes such as nostos, negia, cataphasis, anagnosis, and that those interactions take up resonances that are both explicit and also implicit in the ancient material and in the texts in and through which the ideas have been mediated. Texts and myths have often been discussed in terms of approaches to translational and creative practice that distinguish between transmission of an accepted text or an interpretation and transformation, a concept that covers a range of issues. These may include 1. The reimagination of the text and its narrative and figures, and the way in which its new audiences and readers imagine their own world in that of the ancient text. 2. The transformative function of the work of the writers, storytellers, and theatre practitioners who engage with the ancient material. This engagement sometimes points to a crisis point or watershed in their own aesthetic practices. 3. In addition, there is an increasing degree of overlap between the dynamics associated with transmission and transformation in the present day, as public perceptions of antiquity in the wider community become increasingly distant from knowledge of ancient texts and contexts. Public perceptions increasingly rely on the way that translations, adaptations, and new creative work present antiquity to contemporary sensibilities, both aesthetic and socio-political. In the concluding section, I pose some further questions about ways in which scholars and creative practitioners might interact in the future and raise some specific issues that conference participants might wish to discuss. Practice and theory. There are 2 ancient and modern models for considering how the relationship between the cultural artifact and its relationship to its antecedents is framed, interpreted, and used. I have selected some examples which can be used to discuss how modern responses to ancient material and to intervening and contemporary material are enmeshed. They question and disrupt simple and linear lines of transmission. In this increasingly iterative network of allusions, the response of modern Greek writing to ancient antecedents is pivotal, but by no means unproblematic. Studies of the sometimes contested relationship between antiquity, modernity, and contemporary energies have revealed the richness of this infrastructure for European and world literature, as well as for modern Greek cultural politics. A recent example is a collection of essays edited by Dimitris Diovas, Reimagining the Past, Antiquity and Modern Greek Culture. That collection is especially valuable because of the way it demonstrates how the reception of antiquity cannot be seen in isolation from the reception of other historical periods of Greece, including the Byzantine and Ottoman, and from the reception of the past in those periods and contexts themselves. Professor Diovas' introduction starts with a bold statement, quote, "A nation or country can be judged by the way it engages with its past and its memories," end quote. His discussion continues with focus on the relationship between continuity and diversity, quote, "The debate about the past in Greece involves a clash of 2 competing temporalities, one promoting the notions of succession, continuity, and conservation of the past, and the other based on a hybrid fusion. Relying as they do on linearity and the conservation of ethnic and aesthetic autonomy, earlier notions of the past are now challenged by a postmodern and pre-modern emphasis on the materiality of antiquity and its changing or syncretic daily uses." End quote. I want to acknowledge the importance of this overarching conceptual framework and then to focus this short paper on one small aspect that may contribute to investigation of the larger issues. My focus will be on the literary imagination and the way in which the confluence of ancient, modern, Greek and modern European insights disrupts secure models of linear transmission. This is not only part of a modern transformative aesthetic, but also involves the recognition of the pliability and diversity of the ancient imagination and the insights it injects into the future. Intertextualities, Mahon and Pavlou. My first example is from the work of the modern Irish poet Derek Mahon. Mahon was born in 1941 in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. This is a part of Ireland that is still part of the United Kingdom, but has been afflicted by historic and persisting religious and political divisions. Mahon has worked as a teacher in America, Canada, Ireland, and London, and his poetry often reflects his struggles to find a community to which he can easily belong. This search is set against verbal images of desolate landscapes and scenes of cosmic isolation and floods. His classical education and knowledge provide some settings and also underlies the poetics of his engagement with the themes of longing. My first extract, reproduced on your handout, is taken from Mahon's 2005 poem Calypso, the second and more developed version of which was published in his collection Harbor Lines. The opening line surprises and intrigues the reader. Quote, "Homer was wrong. She never ceased to please." You can see on your handout that there is a quotation within a quotation. The phrase "ceased to please" is taken from the popular translation of Odyssey 5:153 by Rieu. Rieu's translation, published in 1946 by Penguin, has sold many millions of copies and has provided an intertext which Irish poets, including those such as Mahon, Michael Longley, both of whom can read Homer in the original, have used as a springboard for exploration of Homeric themes and of the relationship between Greek and Irish landscapes and politics. There is a rich 20th century Irish tradition of rewriting Homer that starts with James Joyce and Yeats and continues via Patrick Kavanagh, Michael Longley, and Mahon himself. Although there are other echoes of Rieu's phrasing, Mahon's poem moves away from the image of Odysseus weeping on the shore for his lost hope because, quote, "the nymph had long since ceased to please," end quote. Calypso is presented not as a siren distracting him from the journey home, but as a sapphic wild girl. The poem is full of contemporary allusions and is in some sense an anti-epic. However, the problematic ending postpones closure. It leaves open both the final sequence of the Homeric narrative and the role of poetry in the human psyche. Quote, "Homer was wrong. He never made it back, or if he did, spent many a curious night hours still questioning that strange oracular face," end quote. Mahon has reflected on poetry itself. Quote, "No doubt poetry, good or bad, is a waste of time, but waste, drift, contingency are the better part of wisdom," end quote. The iteration from Mahon's poem is multi-directional. I want to mention just two directions, a lateral track to Michael Longley and a temporal track from Pavlou. In so doing, you may be surprised that I shall not refer directly to Mahon's poem Ithaca. This is because, although it is mainly a focalized narrative that follows closely on Homer Odyssey 13:187 to 365, its tone is largely comic, even ironic. It is, however, permeated by with the language of the uncertainty of the displaced person whose anxiety prevents him from recognizing his own past home. Quote, "Will they be primitive and barbarian, or civilized people who will take me in? Those dumb swindlers offered a clear run to Ithaca, and instead they have set me down in a strange place I never saw before." End quote. The tone is also one of ennui. So musing, lost and bored but still alive, he gathered up the gear and made his way along the cold edge of the hissing sea. Yet any inaction is challenged by a theme in the practical words that close the poem. One might also characterize them as advice to the displaced and the immigrant. The future is to be created, not imposed. Quote, "Our first task said Athene, is to stow your gold and bronzes in the sacred cave, and then decide on where we go from there. End quote. We know from Mahon's extensive reading in European literature and from his other poetry that engagement with Cavafy was part of his poetic sensibility. This is sometimes directly acknowledged. For example, Mahon's 2006 collection, Adaptations, contains a sequence entitled Alexandria that is subtitled from the Greek of Constantine Cavafy, 1863 to 1933. This ruminates on the aspirations to encounter new countries, new experiences, and juxtaposes these with the deadening effect of a life confined. Both are illuminated by the insights offered into the physical and psychological effects of age, resentful of their own impatience to be gone. Mahon's intertextuality with Michael Longley. If Mahon's poems represent a revisionist approach to the Odyssey, contextualized in his own sense of displacement and uncertainty of identity, Michael Longley's autobiographical music turns the lens on the associations of the Ithaca poems. Michael Longley was born in 1939, also in Belfast. He studied classics at Trinity College, Dublin. His most recent collection, The Stairwell, 2014, includes a poem, The Alphabet, which meditates on his relationship with his twin brother Peter, who had recently died. The poem consists of 2 4-line stanzas and opens with a reminiscence. Quote, I taught you the Greek alphabet, Peter. End quote. The second quartet continues, quote, a marine engineer on oil tankers, you journeyed around the globe how many times? I died with Nausicaa and Calypso and set sail without you for Ithaca. End quote. The poem is lined in itself, yet significant in the sequence of poems dedicated to his brother. Here, however, I want to draw out how Longley, in alluding implicitly to Mahon's take on Cavafy, involves a comparison between different kinds of voyages. Mahon's poem brings to the fore the uncertainty of the journey and its outcomes, as well as questioning its value and authority in comparison with other journeys through life. Longley's poem represents a response both to Mahon and to Cavafy. Cavafy's poem had invited his interlocutor to pray to the road to Ithaca would belong, that the road to Ithaca would belong, that it would be full of adventures and knowledge, and that it would lead the voyager to encounter and recognize what was in his own psyche. Longley's occasional poem implicitly contains that understanding, and yet also responds to Mahon's combination of je ne suis and diversion from the tasks associated with duty and conformity. Cavafy's allusions are to the sensuous and intellectual jewels of Egypt, reflecting perhaps his dual cultural heritage. Mahon and Cavafy share a sense that Ithaca may have nothing to offer once the wanderer has returned. Longley does not address that aspect. His focus is on the journey and the difference between his own imaginative and metaphorical lingering and the physical and organized journeys undertaken by his brother in the context of his employment, journeys which had a beginning, a middle, and an end. In contrast, Cavafy's Ithaca was plural, as the last line of his poem showed. Poetic practice and theory. How then might we attempt to theorize the interrelated relationships that I have sketched? Here are some suggestions. These are not models that should be applied without discrimination, but rather are models that may suggest further insights into the kinds of dialogical relationships, or rather polyphonic conversations, that are generated by and through modern Greek poetry's engagement both with antiquity and with its geographical and cultural neighbor. Bakhtinian open-endedness. The theory of dialogical relationship that has proved most fruitful for classicists with interests in literary hermeneutics and cultural theory is probably that of Mikhail Bakhtin. From his work has been taken the notion that dialogue is an aspect of human activity that brings the self and the other into a relationship which can be polyphonic and open-ended, and which can provide a point of intercommunication between the past and the future via the present. Although well attuned to the form of the novel, his approach has also been influential among performance scholars because it promotes the concept of the embodied, with the lived body as a material condition of social existence, and performance theorists maintain of communication. But this approach has also been attractive epistemologically because it opens up the possibility that all participants in a dialogue may be and should be heard with attention. Dialogue, thus, involves a plurality of consciousnesses, and his associated concept of the chronotope allows exploration of the relationship between time and space, as well as providing a site for the activities of deliberative communities. In terms of poetry and of the examples that I have mentioned, both Gaddafi and Mahomes play with the expectations set up by the Homeric Odyssey, both using this as a starting point to engage readers and rewriting and subverting them. As with Homer, these poets open up multi-directional possibilities. Other models of poetic intertextuality, deviation, and playfulness exploit visual metaphors, such as palimpsest, which points to inscription, effacement, and reinscription, and hourglass, which points to the direct relationship between the ancient and the modern without attention to what has gone between. Variants that I find illuminating include interweaving, developed by Erika Fischer, to combine performance theory and the demands of cross-cultural theatre, and braiding, which makes more allowance for the persistence of specificities. As developed by the novelist Wilson Harris, braiding allows for aggressiveness and for unpicking and rebraiding. It will already be apparent that the possible ramifications of the dialogue model are considerable and messy, and that each depends on different kinds of agency to activate the potential of the ancient material. There is a further model that merits particular attention, partly because it has been seen as persuasive in that it allows for variations in intensity and outcome. This is the conversation model that has been put forward primarily in literary context, notably by David Hopkins in his collection of essays conversing with antiquity, English poets, and the classics from Shakespeare to Poe. Quote, "The model of literary reception is one of conversation and dialogue, a model which, I hope, might go some way towards mending the rift between reception aesthetics and historicism. The conversation in question is conducted across time and across large cultural divides. Though it might seem at first sight like a conversation between individuals, there are always more than two parties involved. Human beings never come to any conversation without a vast array of existing concepts, experiences, and reading. Conversation always involves the recollection, invocation, and questioning of other conversations. For conversations to be more than exercises in extended solipsism, participants must register the otherness of their interlocutors and proceed on the assumption that they can move towards them to some degree, momentarily escaping or at least taking a momentary glimpse beyond the prison house of their own head and their own environment. But conversation also depends on some sense of continuity, some faith that, however alien their interlocutors' premises and findings might at first sight seem, some sense can be made of their utterances, a sense that does not merely involve rewriting those utterances so that they accord with the conversationalist's own it would, I think, be a mistake to dismiss Hopkins' model as one that results only from the privileged and urbane environment of the literary world. It also embodies ways of looking at the wider world of human activity, but always with a strong transhistorical resonance. Equally important is Hopkins' insistence that conversation implies a degree of negotiation. The combination of those two aspects takes the model away from specificity and conflict. It seems very well attuned to the mediations of the cultural icon that is Ithaca that we saw in the poems by Pavlou, Mahon, and Longhi. In the last part of my paper, I would like to shift the perspective from my focus on creative writing and exploration, and instead consider the implications for scholarship and especially for the kinds of collaborationist encounter exemplified in this conference. After all, interpretations and judgments about the texts we are discussing are made by scholars. Is there, and should be there, a recognition by scholars that their methods have to take account of the subject matter they are researching? Lateral and horizontal dialogues in scholarship. The examples from poetry that I have mentioned in this paper involve creativity that crosses space, place, and language, as well as temporalities. In responding to them and interpreting their relationships, it is therefore necessary to think laterally. The implications for scholars of such lateral-horizontal dialogue have been recently explored by Constance Butenke. She points out that the cognitive dissonance that comes from dealing with more than one field is surely having an effect on how we, as classicists, relate to other humanistic disciplines. Here too, dialogue is of the essence, and it may well be just as difficult to achieve as that is across time, if not more so, given that we're in the case much less able to rely on the comfort of prosopopeia, entering into dialogue not with absent voices, but with current colleagues. This thread in the debate is increasingly present in current research, both into creativity in classical receptions and into scholarship. In an afterword to a special issue of the Classical Receptions Journal that focused on Central and Eastern Europe and receptions of classical poetry, Emily Greenwood commented, quote, "Studying the dissemination of free circulation of classical influences, as well as censorship of classical texts within the continent of Europe, reminds us that there is no center or privileged site for European classical reception studies. In turn, this reminder reinforces the view from classical reception in other parts of the world, which demonstrates the potential of Greek and Roman texts and myths to cut across national and cultural formations." End quote. Here then is the special value of being able to research and discuss the ways in which ancient Greek texts, plays, poetics, and ideas have been refracted, especially in modern Greek literature, aesthetic sensibilities and cultural politics, but also in the temporal, spatial, and lateral relationships that these have with poetry and drama in other languages and cultures. Those interfaces and points of intersection illuminate all the contributing literatures and areas of scholarship. The creative interweavings of experience, imagination, uncertainties, and experiments that will be addressed in the papers that follow over the next 2 days will surely help to set some new questions on the agenda for future research and teaching. I would like to end by posing a few questions that might help with that. What are the texts and authors, ancient and modern, that are most significant in transmission of the crucial features of the ancient texts, and how do these vary across time and place? What are the texts and authors, ancient and modern, that have been and are now the most significant in bringing about transformations of how antiquity is perceived and used? And how do these catalysts vary across time and place? What are the texts and authors, ancient and modern, that offer the most diverse range of energizing elements, debate, experimentation, culture, and force? To what extent do the answers to each of these questions map onto each other? In other words, to what extent are polyphony and polyvalency defining features of both transmission and transformation? Are there any ways in which these qualities are mutually exclusive? Lorna Hardwick, Department of Classical Studies, Open University.